Once adversaries, the Syrian president and the US president meet for the first time at the White House. The relations between both countries are marked by decades of sanctions and isolation under the ousted President Bashar al-Assad's reign, as well as a $10 million ransom for the arrest of the current Syrian president there that was just recently overturned. Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara and the US President Donald Trump are part of a historic turning point in the US-Syrian relations. Trump announced a 6-month suspension of key sanctions under the Caesar Act, delisted al-Shara from the US terrorism list, and pledged full support for Syria's success. While the meeting was held behind closed doors with no press conference, sources revealed that the leaders discussed the integration of Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces into the National Army, political cooperation with the coalition to defeat Daesh, and the possibility of initiating talks with Israel. Will this visit mark Syria's full return to the international legitimacy? Could it signal a new regional balance? And to what extent is the US committed to supporting Syria in the next phase? We're going to attempt to answer these questions in this episode of In Depth. Welcome. According to the Washington Post, Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara met with Trump at the White House, marking a historic first visit by a Syrian leader since 1946. Al-Shara has transitioned into an internationally recognized statesman, seeking U.S. support to rebuild Syria after years of war. The Trump administration suspended the Caesar Act sanctions for 6 months and delisted al-Shara and the Interior Minister from the global terrorist list, easing economic restrictions to allow reconstruction and access to international finance. The two leaders discussed integrating the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces into the Syrian army, and Syria joining the US-led anti-Daesh coalition. While the US has tried to facilitate security talks with Israel, al-Shara emphasized that the broader normalization is not intended currently. Experts note that the U.S. backing strengthens his domestic authority and leverage over Israeli occupation forces as sectarian violence and governance challenges continue to test his leadership. And according to The Guardian, the United States announced a partial suspension of sanctions on Syria following a historic White House meeting between President Donald Trump and the Syrian leader Ahmed al-Shara, the first such encounter since 1946. The meeting marked a dramatic turnaround in relations after years of war and isolation. Trump praised al-Shara as a strong leader, pledging to help Syria rebuild and thrive. Washington granted a 180-day suspension of several Caesar Act sanctions, excluding any transactions involving Russia or Iran. al-Shara, once a rebel leader with a $10 million U.S. bounty, sought relief to revive Syria's economy. The two sides reached what was described as a political agreement, including a plan to integrate Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces into the Syrian army.
For the first time since 1946, a Syrian president walked through the doors of the White House. Ahmed al-Shara's meeting with US President Donald Trump marks a turning point in relations long defined by isolation and sanctions. The White House kept al-Shara's visit low profile and didn't open the Oval Office to the press as with visits from most other world leaders. Trump pledged to support Syria's full recovery after more than a decade of war, saying they will do everything they can to make Syria successful. He praised al-Shara as a strong leader and voiced confidence in him. Al-Shara said the visit was part of a new era in which the country would cooperate with the United States. Just last week, the U.S. Treasury Department removed al-Shara from its specially designated global terrorist list. Before that, the UN Security Council voted to remove him and his interior minister from the UN terrorism blacklist. Following the meeting, Washington announced a partial suspension of sanctions, a decision that could unlock new economic channels for the war-torn country. As part of the sanctions relief measures, the U.S. administration is also issuing a 180-day suspension of the Caesar Act, which since 2019 had sanctioned the former Syrian government. Security was also high on the meeting's agenda, as Syria announced it will join the international coalition to defeat Daesh, marking a shift in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Trump and al-Shara also discussed the integration of the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces into the Syrian army. For Syria, the meeting raises new hopes that years of sanctions, destruction, and international isolation may finally be ending.
To talk to us more about this visit, we're joined from Washington by Ginger Chapman, a lawyer and political analyst, and from Cairo by Mohammed Osman, an international relations specialist. Thank you both for joining me here on In Depth. Let's start off with you, Ms. Chapman. For the first time since 1946, President al-Shara was welcomed into the White House, the first Syrian president since then. Why is this an important moment, and what does this reveal about Trump's vision when it comes to reshaping U.S. policy in the Middle East?
Well, first, thank you, Reham, for having us today, and greetings to your viewers and to your other guest, Dr. Osman. And this is part of Trump's broader strategy. Trump needs to show some type of progress in the Middle East, and Syria is uniquely positioned. And however, one of the things that Trump has to do is he has to overcome the Syrian President al-Shara's past. This is because many Americans were shocked after years, indeed decades, of al-Qaeda being presented as America's mortal enemy and as a terrorist group, then for Trump to have and support President al-Shara, a previous member of al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, HTS, in Syria as the president was quite a surprise to the American people. So now Trump has to normalize our relationship with al-Shara. Trump has to, al-Shara is quite new on the global stage, so he himself has to establish global credibility and gravitas. Al-Shara went from being an insurgent in December of 2024 to being the leader of Syria in January 2025. In September, he was giving speeches at the United Nations. So his ascent is important to Trump's strategy in the Middle East, and mainly two things. One, Trump wants al-Shara to provide security arrangements to work against the Islamic State in Syria and in the Levant. And also, Trump wants al-Shara to join the Abraham Accords. And we did see after their meeting yesterday that al-Shara was reluctant. He said, not at this time, as far as the Abraham Accords are concerned. This is because they share a border with Israel. However, we do see Israel's encroachment, bombing of Syria, their progression to southern Damascus, at the same time that Turkey has an interest in northern Syria. So we do expect to see al-Shara caught between Israel, between Turkey to the north, and then there's also the outstanding issue of Russia and their bases to the west, leading perhaps to a federated Syria. But in the meantime, Trump needs to establish positive relations with Syria, because Syria will be one of the linchpins or one of the factors for Trump to enable his vision of Middle East peace going forward. It remains to be seen if Trump can actually accomplish this. We know that procedural events such as Trump lifted portions of the Caesar Act by way of executive order. However, Congress still needs to follow congressional procedure to repeal the Caesar Act, and there is the potential that with other foreign policy crises and other American trends right now, that this Congress may exact some concessions from Trump in order to repeal the Caesar Act. However, America wants Syria to succeed. They want President al-Shara to succeed, and they want Syria to be part of a larger Middle Eastern peace plan.
Oh, if we can get your take here, Mr. Osman. Now, this visit is described as a diplomatic milestone for President al-Shara personally. How do you think this could possibly change his image internationally, being recognized as a statesman, given, what Ms. Chapman just said over there, that, up until a year ago, he was recognized as an insurgent?
Thank you for having me, Ilham. Greetings to you, to Mrs. Chapman, of course, and to your dear audience. Of course, this is indeed a milestone in Syrian-U.S. relations in general. It is a historical development. Since Syrian independence in 1946, we have never seen a Syrian president welcomed in the White House. However, of course, for it being the inaugural U.S.-Syria summit in the White House, it did under-deliver in so many ways. It was very underwhelming. President al-Shara was welcomed not from the front lawn or the front entrance of the White House. He was not welcomed by President Trump or any of the senior officials of the White House. He was rather driven into the White House through a back door. So why is this significant? Why is this important? Many reports do indicate that there are severe divisions within the Trump administration with regards to their Syria policy, because especially within the U.S. establishment, the State Department, the Pentagon, and even U.S. intelligence agencies, especially the CIA, they do believe that they have to approach President al-Shara's administration conditionally and very cautiously, meaning that they cannot just jump into a formal alliance or a formal partnership or a completely normalized relation between the current Syrian government and the United States, because they do have their concerns, of course, due to, as Mrs. Chapman pointed out, the very questionable background of President al-Shara. She said insurgent. I would say his terrorist background. He led the Al-Qaeda branch of Syria for a few years. He was a major operative in an international terrorist organization and was a wanted terrorist in the United States. That's not the case anymore. However, of course, there are certain concerns within the United States, and there are concerns as well within certain circles, even in Trump's power base.
Do you think that the concerns here may be related as well, not just obviously his background and his past, but to the violence seen against certain minorities in Syria?
Exactly.
Do you think this is going to complicate the relations between them or the normalization between both countries?
Yes, that's exactly what I was coming to, Rehan, because even now many circles within Trump's power base have genuine concerns with regards to how the current Syrian administration treats minorities, especially Christian minorities. We see now President Trump is adopting this new trend to appease his evangelical base in the United States by trying to champion the rights of persecuted Christians all around the world. Christians in Syria, even though now they constitute a very small community, they have been subjected to horrendous violations since President al-Shara has come to power, including a bombing that took the lives of scores of Christian worshippers in a church. And also his treatment, the treatment of Druze and the Alawites and even the Kurds. The Kurds are the U.S.'s historical allies in Syria over the past 13 or 14 years in their fight against ISIS. However, it seems that President Trump himself is very interested in advancing this relationship forward. He sees it as a golden opportunity to secure Syria as an ally of the United States and even as a potential normalizer with Israel. We should never forget that there are ongoing discussions and talks and negotiations, no matter how Syria tries to deny them, between Syria and Israel, mediated by the United States over a potential security agreement and even a peace agreement between Syria and Israel. These are things that President Trump is very interested in. And also from a geopolitical perspective, he is very interested in keeping, along with Israel and Turkey and many other countries in the West, they are very interested in keeping Syria out of the Russian and Iranian spheres of influence. For most of its post-independence history, Syria has always been an anti-Western agent, either an ally of the Soviet Union, an ally of Russia, an ally of Iran. Now, this is very strategic, geopolitically geolocated strategic country in the Middle East. It's a very important country, Syria, vast natural resources, many international trade routes go through this very strategic piece of land. So it's very important to keep it within their spheres of influence. So now they do believe they invested in the fall of President Assad. The United States did invest in that along with Israel and the collective West. And now they have an interest in making the post-Assad government or the post-Assad administration in Syria successful, no matter, regardless of the background of the current leadership.
Okay, Ms. Shepman, if we can get your take here. Now, you heard Mr. Osman there talking about how this was a relatively unusually low-profile meeting with Al-Shara coming in through the back doors, no joint press conference or televised statement. Why do you think that, in your opinion, there is a secrecy behind what has actually happened behind the closed doors? Do you think this is caution from Trump moving forward? Or do you think this is a way of sending out a message, I suppose, to the Syrian president that we have our concerns when it comes to certain topics like violence against minorities?
Yes. Well, and what the American people have seen is that violence against minorities, sectarian violence, has been prevalent in Syria since, well, essentially, even during the reign of Bashar al-Assad. We do know that some of the sectarian violence was enhanced, provoked by the American administration from about 2014 on, because the American administration did want to stir up a civil war essentially against Assad. After this 14-year process, we now have new leadership in Syria. However, al-Shara does have to navigate, as Dr. Osman pointed out, the presence of Russia, which has actually acted as a stabilizing force in Syria. And al-Shara is aware that attacks on Christians are something that President Trump would be very loudly opposed to. President Trump has made statements about protecting Christians in other countries. So it appears that al-Shara will endeavor to do what he can to tamp down the sectarian violence.
But do you think that Trump also has a vested interest in propping up the current administration of Syria to sort of stave off the Russians?
Yes, and once again, because of our proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, and also especially because Russia has had a very large presence in Syria. They were actually there previously at the invitation of al-Assad, that the United States has to be very careful with Russian relations in Syria. And indeed, al-Shara did visit Moscow earlier this year in order to see if Putin could continue to essentially operate his bases, Tartus, Hmeimim, on the West Coast, because that is a stabilizing influence. And the HTS fighters do appear to respect the Russian forces. Also, because of Israel's ongoing activity, Israel has been engaging in constant airstrikes in southern Syria. There is a need for a counterweight in Syria. And President Trump is also going to have to navigate between international relations. Once again, Turkey is an important partner in Syria, and they also have a vested interest in northern Syria. This does indicate that there may be future conflicts between Turkey in the north and Israel in the south. And of course, al-Shara and President Trump have been quiet about their closed-door meeting, but al-Shara is going to have to navigate the presence of Israel on their southern border, Israel's greater ambitions, at the same time that President Trump is going to need to contain Israel in order to show progress, once again, on his peace plan in the Middle East. There is a great deal happening right now, not just the situation in Gaza, but also fast-moving events in Syria, which Trump is hoping will enable him to make further progress in Gaza. And of course, Trump is also going to request and rely on the Arab Gulf states to participate in the rebuilding of Syria. Syria is in desperate need of infrastructure rebuilding, in desperate need of humanitarian aid, social and cultural aid. And for these reasons, Trump is going to have to negotiate with
It's a balancing act,
other Arab.
basically. A balancing act from both sides, whether it be the Syrian president or President Trump.
Exactly. And so Syria is in a very unique position. The eyes of the Middle East are on Syria because they are going to become an impetus or a big player in Trump's Middle East plan. And this is because Trump needs a win. We are bogged down in Palestine. It appears difficult for Trump to make progress past phase 1 into phase 2. He is working on that. However, what happens in Syria is also going to affect broader Middle Eastern relations, the broader Middle Eastern peace plan, especially the involvement of the Gulf states. Trump wants to use Syria as a way to weaken Iran, prevent Iran from using Syria as a transit point, to drive a wedge between Hezbollah and Hamas. So there are a great many players on all sides of the political divide: Turkey, Iran, Palestine, Israel, many players, not just Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran's support for them, but also al-Shara's ability to contain the various sectarian groups and the violence in Syria. This is going to be important going forward. It appears al-Shara is protecting Christians for Trump, but indeed he is going to have to protect all of the sectarian groups in order to make progress. Also, the American Trump desperately wants to build a military base near Damascus, and this military base is, of course, going to be an important point, a forward base where America can monitor and observe the relationship and developments between Syria and Israel, as well as between Syria and other countries in the Middle East, other nations. So Trump really wants Syria and al-Shara to play a big role in further plans for the Middle East.
Okay, let's get Mr. Osman's take here now. Syria has also signed a political declaration with the coalition to defeat Daesh, explicitly stating it is a non-military entity. How does this reflect Damascus's attempt to redraw its image and be integrated into the international community, and as well Shara's image worldwide? As we spoke about earlier in the episode, up until a year ago, he was considered part of this group, or an insurgent group.
Yeah, you remember, just before President al-Shara flew from Damascus to Washington, suddenly we heard about ISIS plots to assassinate President al-Shara that have been uncovered over the past few months, and that the Syrian security forces are taking very decisive action against ISIS operatives in several parts of Syria, and so on and so forth. It's as if the new administration in Syria wants to market itself as a power that can counter terrorism, or that is serious about countering Islamist extremist terrorism in Syria. Of course, because we all know that ISIS's major operations were launched from within Syria and Iraq, and if they ever re-emerge once again on such a scale, it will most probably be from Syria due to the very fluid security situation over there. And of course, President al-Shara was trying to market himself and his administration as reliable partners of the United States in fighting ISIS, instead of the Syria Democratic Forces, the SDF. It's basically a military structure or a militia that is led by the Kurds, basically. However, it does contain a lot of Arab Sunni components as well, because some might try to portray them all the time as an ethnic Kurdish militia, which, by the way, is not true. So they are a coalition of Arab tribes and Kurdish organizations as well, who did do a very good job fighting ISIS with US support. However, now it seems that the United States wants to integrate the SDF inside the new Syrian army and the new Syrian government, and that they are not really interested in sponsoring or supporting any secessionist projects inside Syria with regards to the Kurds. And of course, this is to appease and take into account Turkey's security concerns. Turkey will never allow the emergence of a Kurdish state in Syria, and Turkey did threaten military action on more than one occasion in case this happens. So it seems that now President al-Shara is trying to hammer the steel while it's still hot, basically, in order to achieve even more results. And this resulted in this agreement or this declaration. However, of course, this declaration came short of including Syria in the anti-ISIS US alliance, because this would require Syria to go to basically satisfy certain categories that it can't. And one of them is basically that the new governing force in Syria and its army and its security forces ideologically are not that different from ISIS. Both of them used to be one organization before Jabhat al-Nusra split from ISIS and refused to pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi back then. So it's very interesting to see how the US is trying to work around this. There are genuine concerns inside the United States that Trump might sell out the SDF in favor of a complete partnership with the new Syrian government. It seems that things are going in that direction with Turkish pressure and support. However, there are certain elements within this US administration and within the US deep state, basically, especially the security apparatuses and the Pentagon and even the State Department, have their genuine concerns on this, and they do not really support the idea of completely abandoning the SDF. So this is basically how I see this declaration to him.
Okay, if we can get Ms. Chapman's take here. Now, the U.S. has delisted the Syrian President Bashar, specifically under the designated global terrorist list. What message do you think this sends to the international community, and what does Trump expect from Shara, given that he has delisted him? I'm sure there is a price to pay there.
Yes, well, delisting al-Shara is it's one step towards al-Shara gaining acceptance on the world stage. However, one thing that is interesting is al-Shara's background as far as his previous history with Al-Qaeda, with his period of imprisonment in Iraq, and then afterwards, after he got out of prison in Iraq and forming al-Nusra. It is suspected on the part of Americans that at some point al-Shara began working with our own government, became a CIA asset, or at least became an asset. And this is one of the reasons why al-Shara was a candidate for the presidency, even though during his in December, al-Shara and HTS's progression into Damascus took the world by surprise. No one expected his ascension to be this rapid. Now that he is in power, he does have ties, previous ties with the CIA. This is one of the reasons why the American government perhaps wants to work with him. We do know that Israel is one of the parties that was also behind al-Shara being in Damascus, perhaps because they view, perhaps the international community views al-Shara as someone that President Trump and the West can work with. We do know he's a very
I'm sorry, but I have to cut you
pragmatic.
off there because we're out of time. But the point there is clear that there are ties previously to the US. That was Ginger Chapman, a lawyer and political analyst, and Mohammed Osman, an international relations specialist. Thank you both for your insights and thank you for joining us here. This brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Thank you for joining us and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.